He who examines these strange conditions in an impartial and thoughtful way comes to the conclusion that the state legislature must have help this time from the outside. The petty, corrupt party spirit fails today, and where it fails, also its child, the legislature, will fail. The problem to be solved demands a liberal spirit, ready to make sacrifices. The situation demands from the party members something which appears to us as suicide of capital, although in this case only the suicide of a candidate for death is involved. Pain paralyzes, and therefore the partyman fails, just like a patient when the surgeon throws the instruments on the bed with the words, "Your leg is gangrenous. I have no time. Cut it off yourself." The incision, which now has to be made on the body economic, cannot be made by the state legislature. It would be cruelty to ask this from it. Only someone not himself linked with the body to be operated on and not sensing the pain can make the necessary incision of salvation. It is possible that I underrate the power of decision of the Bavarian National Assembly. I should be glad indeed if it were so. Perhaps this state legislature, after 8 months of revolts and coups, now recognizes at last that it must rise to strong action by giving to a purely proletarian cabinet the knife and authority to perform the operation. However, I cannot believe it. I do not think this poor little heap of misery left by the war to be capable of such power of decision, but let us assume that it is. Whether the proletarian executive, formed with the consent of the state legislature, will call itself Soviet government or parliamentarian government, what does it matter? The fact will remain that the state legislature failed us in these difficult times and, for its own good, had to surrender the executive power to the proletariat. More than this, the Soviet government did not want, at least not for the present. The Soviet government was to perform what the law of self-preservation made impossible to perform by the state legislature. I recognize, therefore, the necessity of extraordinary action, and it does not matter to me in what outward form this action is performed, whether by command of a proletarian executive of the democratic government or by the so-called Soviet government. I attach no importance on these purely formal differences. I mention these things only in order to explain why I, as a pronounced individualist, could enter the service of the Soviet government. The fact that this Soviet government elected me as Minister of Finance was proof for me that Bolshevism, communism, was not, or at least not yet, involved. To me, the Soviet government was an almost inescapable evolutionary sector of the political and economic collapse, and I saw the probability that after the performance of the life-saving incision, the state legislature would regain the powers to continue the regime without further assistance. Shaping myself to the aims of the Soviet government, I saw my task in making this great incision for the prevention of state bankruptcy and complete disintegration, the great property sacrifice, and to carry it out without the aid of the Berlin paper money fabrication. After the close of this work, the purpose of the Soviet government would, in my opinion, have been reached. The road for the democratic government would again have been free. Of course, I also saw the further possibility that they might be linked with the name of the Soviet government, possibilities which I shall fight with all my strength, and which I shall discuss later. For 20 years, with some interruption, I have been settled in Switzerland. In January, I went to Berlin in order to prepare a new edition of my work, The Natural Economic Order. In March, I learned in Berlin that Mr. Nikisch, with whom I had exchanged some letters during recent years, and who had contributed to the Social Democratic Press articles on my theory of interest, was prominent in the social movement of Munich. Thereupon, I wrote to my friend, Dr. Kristen, who called upon Mr. Nikisch personally. Straightway I received the telegraphic inquiry as to whether I would act as a member of the Socialization Commission of the Hoffman government. I answered in the affirmative. I would have called attention to the necessity of socializing the money system as I conceive it. When no further communication reached me from Munich and my work was terminated in Berlin, I started on my journey back to Switzerland and arrived on April 1st in Munich. By telephone, I learned that Mr. Nikisch had gone to Berlin and was expected back on April 5th. So I decided to wait. The stay was agreeable to me, as I could talk over many things with Dr. Kristen concerning the publication of new books and the establishment of the German Freed Land and Freed Money League. I lived with Dr. Kristen and prepared the meals for both of us. I had much to do reading printer's proofs and hardly went out of doors, and consequently failed to pay a number of visits which I had intended to make. Only casually did I read the newspaper reports on the peace discussions. The Bavarian daily politics had little interest for me.